Welcome to Community Roundtable. I'm Nick Burns from the Salt Lake Community College Division of Communication and Performing Arts, and today on the show we're talking about human rights, peace, and justice in Africa. We're also exploring topics on refugees arriving and thriving in Utah. I'll speak with human rights activist and best-selling author John Pendergast. He's worked for peace and for justice in Africa for over 30 years. Also joining us later on the show from Salt Lake City International Rescue Committee, Jesse Sheets. John Pendergast, thank you for being here.
Thanks, Nick.
So, you've worked in the Clinton White House, National Intelligence Council, UNICEF, Human Rights Watch. You've worked with Hollywood royalty. You run 3 of your own businesses, institutes. How do you come to a job like this? What motivates somebody to spend 30 years on Africa?
I certainly didn't plan that in high school. I had a whole career path. First of all, I was going to play in the NBA, but that didn't work out. So I ended up wanting to work with kids, underprivileged kids in the U.S. And one night I saw pictures of a famine that was unfolding in Ethiopia in the early to mid 1980s, 1983 it was. And I just hadn't seen anything on that scale before. Human suffering, literally, as far as the eye could see, thousands of people starving to death. And I just intellectually was inflamed by how such a thing could happen, and morally I felt compelled to understand it better. So as a young person would do, I said, well, I'm just going to go. And one-way ticket to Africa.
You just went?
$100 in my pocket. So.
And what did you land to?
Well, I ended up in Mali, which is in 4 countries over. I didn't have much knowledge about Africa, so I didn't really realize what I was getting myself into. But when you go out of your skin, when you take a chance, often serendipity or divine intervention, whatever you happen to believe, intervenes. And I happened on the plane going into Mali, into the capital city, meet a fella who was from Mali and was running the entire food security unit in the agricultural ministry. So he was like the one person you would want to talk to about why people starve amidst plenty. And he took me under his wing, and we went traveling all around the country. And then I actually met other people and got a job. One door leads to another door leads to another door. I think a lot of people that end up in these kinds of careers have these stories that none of it makes any sense, and there's no linear pattern.
Well, the secret must be that when there's a door, you go through it.
Yes.
Rather than just look at it.
Yeah.
I mean, you're like, I'll go to Africa, I'll chat with this guy on the plane.
A lot of door knocking, a lot of bloody knuckles from no answers. But once you do get into new rooms, you find new doors that you never knew existed. Yeah. And so that, for me, to get back to your question, is like, once I went, my entire game plan, my entire career path was dramatically altered. Yeah. And I ended up wanting to understand, well, how could it be that in a world which is extraordinarily wealthy writ large, in pockets of especially in the continent of Africa, pockets were ripped apart by conflict, and people by the millions were on the brink of starvation. So that's what sort of motivated me to get involved.
Have you learned how that can happen?
Yeah, I think one of the big reasons, one of the underlying causes, probably the most potent one, is that we expect here in the United States our government, for the most part, to deliver services, schools, hospitals, other kinds of things that garbage collection. We expect our police and our army to the extent possible protect our borders, to maintain some level of security. Well, in some of these countries, in Africa at least, the government has been hijacked by a small group of people, usually military officers and a few very high-ranking people. They have some commercial, some business people who are in league with them. And the reason they hijack the government is in order to extract the extraordinary natural resource wealth of the country. So in many of these countries we see that are starving, that are being destroyed by war, scratch beneath the surface, gold, oil, diamonds, all kinds of different minerals. And these folks that have hijacked the government, we call them kleptocrats, a kleptocratic state where the intention of the governing system is not to benefit the people, it is to benefit the few. to extract the wealth for the privatize the wealth to advantage the small. And then of course they have international enablers and facilitators, banks and attorneys who set up shell companies and arms dealers and mining companies, and all these people are getting rich while people are starving.
Starving in front of them. And I've heard that profiting from mineral extraction, diamonds, golds, etc., that's where the rapes happen. That's where the military groups are thriving.
Yeah, I think one of the tactics you understand, it's sort of the same we understand about drug dealers being, the most ruthless ones are able to garner the largest territory in terms of their market, in terms of the illegal drug trafficking. Well, it's no different in the mining sector, where the rule of law has been undermined, where these kleptocratic states have taken over. So the guys with the biggest guns who commit the most terrifying atrocities are often the ones that are able to corner the market on these minerals and other natural resources, and are able to benefit financially from
themselves. Yeah. So when it comes to Africa, it seems to me that many people here in the United States, in the dominant culture, they see Africa as this sort of unknowable, it's the other, it's impenetrable. Where do you think that comes from, and how does that get in the way of actually helping people there?
Yeah. Well, I think you look sometimes at maybe the way media has portrayed Africa. So there's the movie paradigm, where you have a long history of film where Africa is usually portrayed as very weak, sometimes
dark continent, yes,
frightening military characters, and easily exploited, and victims as opposed to functioning three-dimensional people. And so you have this victimization that exists in movies, and then on television, it's sort of the nonfiction version of it is, this stories go in. If it bleeds, it leads. So of course they're going to go to the worst places. So they're not covering all of the democracies in Africa. Where's the story? They're covering where there's a conflict. So the vast majority of Africa may be at peace and may be developing economically, which it is, but the cameras are going to go where there's a famine or where there's a war. And so we have a skewed perception of what exactly happening on this continent.
So I have to ask you this, the Satellite Sentinel project, which you put together with George Clooney, I'm fascinated by this notion of using satellite data and geoimaging to help people on the ground. How does that work? Are you looking at drought or climate or military action or all of the above?
Yeah,
what is that?
Well, it originated, we were on the border between Sudan and South Sudan, which had been a great deal of conflict and atrocities had been committed there. And one night we came back we had this little camp where we were staying in tents and stuff, and George and I are two talkers. We stay up all night talking, and he started saying, well, they have all these people following me, paparazzi, and even Google Earth, they watch my driveway, see who's coming in. I'm like, and he's like, why? I wish there could be a way that we could shine a spotlight on some of these war criminals who are committing mass atrocities in complete darkness. Because of course they prohibit journalists and others to go into some of these areas. So we started gaming it out, like, well, what if we did? And so we came back and we talked to Google, we talked to a bunch of satellite companies. We don't know anything about this stuff. And so they got kind of lit up about it and got excited about it. So we formed this partnership with the world's largest satellite company and actually an academic unit, the Harvard Humanitarian Initiative, to do the satellite imagery reading. And we started having the satellites watching areas where we knew things were happening, terrible things were happening, atrocities were happening, but there was no independent international witness to that.
You couldn't, you can't shoot a satellite the way you can shoot a journalist.
Right. And so we were gathering all this undeniable proof of massive war crimes, front page in the New York Times every time we put a report out and all this other stuff, and nightly news and all this. And guess what? Well, the people that were committing these atrocities were not shameable. And the information, sadly, did not move the needle enough on the political system in our country and other countries to actually then do
To
something.
do something.
So we, just 2 years ago, had a long, George and I are constantly second guessing ourselves. We're Irish, it's what we do. And we were thinking, well, is this really, is this making a difference? I mean, it gets a lot of attention. Everybody thinks it's a great thing, but it's not doing anything. So we shifted at that point our attention and resources and said, the one thing that these guys do, they can't be shamed. They don't care if the United Nations Security Council passes a resolution condemning them, and they don't care if they sign a peace deal and then don't implement it. None of those things matter to them. However, those same guys committing the war crimes are the same ones stealing all the resources. And they do not keep their money under their mattresses. They put it in the
So
international
that's the
financial
secret?
system. That's their
Okay.
vulnerable point, and that's what we're starting to go after now.
Okay. When we come back, let's talk about that.
Okay.
Keep it tuned to our show today. We're talking about peace, justice, and human rights in Africa. We'll be right back. We are back on Community Roundtable talking with John Pendergast, who's been working in Africa for 30 years. When we left off, you were talking about the one way to reach these guys in Africa, the warlords, the despots, is their money.
Right.
And we can do that. We can go rob their bank accounts.
Well, it turns out that the vast majority of financial transactions in the global economy are conducted in US dollars. And if a crime is committed using US dollars, the United States Treasury Department has jurisdiction over those dollars.
Because it's dollars.
Right.
Ah.
Now we're not tracing every transaction. We don't have the person power to do that. So we focus on things like ISIS and Al-Qaeda movement of money, or the Iranian leadership and where do they hide their assets, the Russian oligarchs and Putin allies who we're going after now, and those kinds of actors. So for a warlord in Africa, or a despot and a dictator in Africa, there just isn't the time and attention. So George and I thought, well, what if we create our own financial intelligence unit, our own financial forensic investigative team that can comb the global financial infrastructure for evidence of where these dictators and warlords are stashing their assets, where they're buying big houses in other people's names and creating shell companies and all the rest of it, and turn that evidence over to the Treasury Department, the Justice Department, and Scotland Yard, and other entities around the world that have jurisdiction depending on what
On those areas, yeah.
And so that's what we did. We set up something called the Sentry, hired a bunch of these remarkable asset chasers who normally are doing it related to counterterrorism stuff, but we're saying let's do it for stopping human rights violations. And we've just gone public with it in the last 6 months, so it's a brand new outfit.
So the Satellite Sentinel project, right, using the satellites,
Is no more.
now Sentry,
Yes.
and then you also have a third group that you run.
The Enough project is basically an effort. Now, in fact, this month we're going to be 10 years old. It's an effort to try to build political will for taking greater action by policymakers for these places in Africa that are often forgotten. That's why I'm here. So we're constantly working, particularly with student groups and faith-based groups and other kind of small little human rights interested community groups around the country. We use celebrities to do outreach, so because you get a lot more attention on your issues if you have these kinds of gimmicks, to be able to put the spotlight on a particular issue that normally doesn't get any attention. So the Enough project is building political will, while the Sentry is doing these deep dive investigations.
And are you fundraising also, or this is George Clooney's money?
24/7 is all I do.
All you do?
Yeah, this
I
is
mean,
my
you're
little
worse than a
break from
politician,
fundraising.
right?
It's horrible, because they, every 2 years, and if they lose, well, they're out. But me, if I lose, the organization goes underwater, and that's it. So no, we're always looking for a new donor. So it's if anyone's out there.
Yeah, time to call.
Yeah.
So the Enough Project, quote, peace and justice in Africa by helping to create real consequences for perpetrators and facilitators of genocide and other mass atrocities. Are you working with the International Criminal Court?
Oh yeah. The International Criminal Court doesn't have a capacity to go after the finances of the people that they're prosecuting. So
Okay.
we are working with them now to give them greater intelligence and information related, building dossiers basically for them for some of the cases that they're working on. So they're prosecuting a person for the war crimes that they committed, the human rights violations they committed, child soldier recruitment, rape as a tool of war, attacking villages, these kinds of things. And then we're providing information about, well, where is that person's finances so that they can round out their investigation.
And Omar al-Bashir, who was indicted years ago but kind of hiding in plain sight, doesn't always work real well.
Yeah, our hope is by the end of this year, we're going to have a pretty good sense of where he's keeping much of his resources.
Oh, cool.
So George and I and the team that we have are not going to rest until there is some consequence for what he has done. I mean, you commit genocide in Darfur, the first genocide of the 21st century. He's dropping bombs on villages in other parts of Sudan with impunity. I mean, it's unacceptable. And the world has moved on. Darfur was 10 years ago.
Everybody cares about Syria now, and Africa seems forgotten,
and
unfortunately.
we're not forgetting.
Okay.
So we're zeroed in on this guy, and we will figure out a way, one way or another, for him to pay a price.
So you've got, George Clooney in Hollywood, you've got these groups, you've got your own investigators. Are folks like you in a better place to do this than governments or NGOs or corporations themselves in terms of cleaning things up?
Well, it goes back to this point about just capacity. Our government, and as a taxpayer, I get it. I don't disagree. They're focused their intelligence assets on counterterrorism stuff. They're focusing on nuclear non-proliferation. They're focusing on major organized crime, and there just isn't enough money to do the kind of work we're proposing to do on these second-tier issues. So we said, no problem, we'll do it. And we're hiring the same people they use. So in other words, when we come to them with dossiers full of information, it's not me, some human rights activist, it's someone who they've worked with for 20 years. And they're like, oh, well, it's him, let's bring it in. And let's talk about what we can do with this now. So there's a level of trustworthiness, I guess, because we have created an entity that is acceptable to the people we're trying to influence and is effectively an unspoken partner in what they can do. We expand their capacity by virtue of what we're doing.
Because you're doing it.
Yeah.
So we have to take another quick break, but I want to ask you real fast before we do that. Your energy is unbounded here. What do you do about getting burned out? This is really difficult stuff you do.
Well, I think I'm a relatively optimistic person. I shouldn't be because of my sports teams; they're all losers. But whatever. But in terms of the work, I think of places like there were these terrible wars in West Africa, the Blood Diamonds Wars. As soon as we figured out that it was our demand for those diamonds that was fueling those conflicts, and they created an international system to keep the blood diamonds out of the international marketplace. Within a couple of years, those wars were over. You just have to find the key. Each war is different. Each conflict has a different historical root. To understand and then develop the political will to create those levers and bring those levels of influence onto those situations, and I believe you can turn them around.
So 30 years on, you're seeing progress. That's pretty cool. We'll be back with more Community Roundtable right after this. Keep it tuned. We are back on Community Roundtable. Joining us now, Jesse Sheets. Hi.
Hello.
So, the Salt Lake City and International Rescue Committee Donations Manager. It seems obvious what you do, Donations Manager, but how do you get to a job like yours?
Yeah, so I started at the University of Utah.
Okay.
I majored in international studies, had no direction, but that I was volunteering at the International Rescue Committee. I went there 2 hours a week at their front desk, saw people come in of all nationalities. The IRC supports, in Salt Lake City alone, upward of 15 different nationalities coming into the state of Utah. And so just being able to see people on a weekly basis, gaining comfort, learning English, they come to you and they sign in. But the first time that they come to you and try to sign in, they don't necessarily know how to sign their name. But by the fourth or fifth time, they're there, they're speaking to you back and forth, and you can see that change happen.
So you're a college success story. You went from volunteering and got employed.
Yes. it
And
was
helping
within,
refugees to boot.
Within 3 months of graduating, I had this job. So,
Awesome.
Yeah.
Congratulations.
It does work sometimes.
No, it does work. So, I mean, Utah is such a welcoming place for refugees. Our own governor has spoken out, right? We're an outlier compared to nationally, I think.
Yes.
So, you had just mentioned 15 different countries. So, the refugees that are coming here, your group works with over, 500 a year?
Yeah, so alongside Catholic Community Services, there are about 1,100 refugees coming into Utah annually.
And so, are these people mostly from specific places? Tell me about who these folks are.
Yeah, there are a lot of different ways that refugees come to a specific state or city. It could be that there's a large population, so like Minnesota, there's a large population of Somali refugees, and so they will actively resettle there because they know that they'll be more successful because they have a community base. In Utah, there are a couple of different populations that we resettle more of. So last year, our highest populations were DR Congo, Iraq, and Burma. So those were some of the larger populations coming in. Mm-hmm.
And are these folks coming directly or living in refugee camps for years, or what's the pathway to get to Salt Lake City?
Yeah, every 550 people arrive on an annual basis, 550 different pathways to get here. So people may linger in refugee camps intergenerationally. Their parents may have been forced into a refugee camp, their children born in a refugee camp, and then they come as teenagers to the U.S. Or it could be that conflict broke out a few years ago, as we see in the case of Syria, where we just kind of commemorated the 6th anniversary of unrest in that country. And mildly, yes,
Yeah.
where over 11 million people have been displaced violently from that country. And they have been fleeing in different directions, where they might be waiting in Jordan. The third largest city in Jordan in 2015 was a refugee camp.
Refugees from Syria,
Mhm.
yeah. So what you do here, people get a home, they get appropriate clothing. I mean, if you come from sub-Saharan Africa, you're probably not used to winter and snow. Food and toiletry items, jobs, employment.
Yeah, those are all services that we're able to offer. So in Utah specifically, the International Rescue Committee is able to provide 24-month case management. So,
2 years, okay.
which is incredible. Across the United States, even in our network, it may just be 3 or 6 months. If you can imagine trying to learn English, get a job, make sure your kids are enrolled within 3 months of arrival, with maybe no net of safety beyond that, that can be pretty daunting. So we are very lucky that the state provides additional funding for those services to be provided. We're there in the weeks prior, making sure that housing is set up, making sure that those items are put into a home. We meet people at the airport. We make sure that they have a culturally appropriate hot meal, which doesn't mean a hamburger or a hot dog. It
Take them
means
to McDonald's.
exactly.
Oh, geez.
It
Welcome
means
to
something
America.
that they would be used to eating, so that they have that kind of moment of rest and welcome
Wow.
and familiarity. Oftentimes, their caseworker will speak their language because they are a former refugee themselves, or we have an interpreter there who can help with that.
I mean, that's got to help.
Yeah.
So education, I mean, you got to get kids in school.
Mhm.
I know of a student here at Salt Lake Community College who was educated through the 3rd grade in Ethiopia before coming here as a teenager and being dropped into high school.
Exactly.
What about education for moms and dads? I mean, people coming from a refugee camp, no running water. You put them in an apartment with a toilet and you give them like a quart of toilet bowl cleaner. I mean, how does that work?
Yeah, so that's where our caseworkers step in, for
Okay.
sure. We make sure that they're enrolled in English classes so they can start learning a bit more about English and our systems here in the US. But a caseworker's job is to introduce people who are not familiar with our systems, who are not familiar with running water and locking doors and those types of things, to that. And that isn't necessarily the majority of refugees. A lot of people come in, they're from urban environments, they speak 5 or 6 different languages. English just may not be one of them. So people are very capable, but the caseworker is there to ensure that they have the support they need to be successful.
And is that typical for refugees? Like you said, 550 different paths, but the stereotype is someone poor who's been on the run or been on the walk or whatever. But as you say, many of these people might be urban dwellers. They might be quite successful or professionals in their other country. And
Yeah, which is definitely the case. There are people who had to flee because their entire city was demolished. They have no safe return because they have no place to return to.
it's gone, yeah.
Exactly. And so there are people who come in who have the certifications, who were highly educated, who lived lives much like ours, and have no way of returning to that. And so oftentimes it is being knocked back down. They start at a very low place, but we're there to ensure that they can move from that place and start businesses so that their kids can go to school, so that they can get an entry-level position, but it might mean that we are also there to support them with recertification programs and those types of things as they move forward, looking to kind of rebuild their life here in the U.S.
So speaking of getting ahead, one thing I wanted to ask about was the Spice Kitchen,
Yes.
the incubator kitchen, and there are many people who are refugees who are like making little hot sauces and whatnot and they're doing great.
Spice Kitchen Incubator is an incredible program. I think it supports both low-income immigrants and refugees, but other low-income individuals in the community to start food businesses right here in Salt Lake City. They do prepared foods, packaged foods. They make sure that they get them into farmers markets or onto store shelves. There's this great program, Spice to Go, that they just started up in the last few weeks, where every Thursday they feature a new spice entrepreneur, and you can go pick up food from a different entrepreneur. You could have food from Iraq, from Sudan, from Burma, each different week. We have an Armenian individual who does Spudnik is the name. They do baked potatoes, but there's a breadth of food businesses that we've been able to support.
And again, this kitchen is, commercial kitchen, safe, sanitary. I mean, it meets all the codes, so you can go into business and you're helping people.
Exactly, yeah.
So we've only got a couple minutes left, but one thing I want to ask about that kind of shocked me was internet access and bicycles. Seemed key to what you do, and I was just thrilled by that, especially the bike collective you're involved with.
Yeah, so digital literacy, especially because every bank that you work with has online access. Everybody's asking you to have automatic bill pay into your accounts. Schools are often asking more and more, even for young grades, to have access to a computer with internet access. And those aren't things that are necessarily within a budget. And so just having that access and then being able to provide transportation, a reliable form of transportation. Our bus system works pretty well, but if you need to make it onto a job at a specific time, that's when it kind of fails you. And so having a bike and being able to work with places like the Bike Collective really helps us provide those access points.
And for people who want to get involved, where would you send them? How do people help?
Yeah, if they want to get involved locally here in Salt Lake, rescue.org/SLC, our website, that would be the first point of entry. You can find out how you can provide in-kind donations, get involved as a volunteer or an intern, learn more about advocating for refugees to welcome them here into the country.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks
Jesse
so much.
Sheets. John Pendergrass, thank you very much for your work, which seems like unending.
Thanks, Nick. Thanks for having us.
And for people who want to learn more about what you do?
www.enoughproject.org.
Simple enough. Thank you to you both for taking time to join us on Community Roundtable.
Thanks.
Thank you.
And thank you for joining us on Community Roundtable as well. For information about all Salt Lake Community College academic and community programs, information about student resources, upcoming campus events, and more, it's simple, slcc.edu. We'll see you next time on Community Roundtable. I'm Nick Burns. Keep watching.